Hello, I'm delighted to be with you today to address this question: was Crozant Idunum in 507? A question that undoubtedly resonates with the people of Dun-le-Palestel. George Verjard, in his monograph from the 50s, tells us, "We have already reported the data of tradition which holds that Dun was devastated in the very first centuries of our era and only rose again at the end of the Middle Ages." While reporting this oral tradition, he explained that the 6th century text, the life of Saint Eptadii, mentions the destruction in 507 of a castrum named Idunum. The websites of the Pays Dunois refer to this, but often with errors, sometimes confusing the Burgundians and the Visigoths. For my part, I had encountered this in Michel Rouche's dissertation, Aquitaine from the Visigoths to the Arabs, and in his book Clovis, which indeed placed this destroyed Idunum at Dun-le-Palestel. So I wanted to know more. The Vita Eptadii was written around 550 by a Creuse Society of the Saint who remained anonymous. Historians regard the text as reliable and precisely dated. Saint Eptadii of Servan being the place where he founded a monastery near Autun, was a hermit close to Clovis at the time of the Frankish conquest of Visigothic Aquitaine in alliance with the Burgundians. Eptadii had refused the bishopric of Auxerre that Clovis offered him, and as a hermit had taken refuge in the forests of the Morvan. Nevertheless, Clovis supported him, financially as well, in freeing prisoners of war. Michel Rouche underlines the political skill of Clovis in associating himself with a popular religious figure who escaped ecclesiastical hierarchy. One might compare this to Saint Geneviève of Paris. We know this text from only 2 copies, independent of one another. A first manuscript from the 11th century, kept at the monastery of Moissac and given to Notre Dame of Paris in 1656, and a second from the 14th century, from the Franciscan Legendary of Toulouse. They differ notably in the spelling of Idunum, with I in the first, HI in the second. The first manuscript was edited by Philippe Labbé in 1657, then by the Bollandists, Papenbroek and Cuperes, and then by Martin Bouquet in 1741. This last edition is the one used by the Limousin scholars. In 1896, the edition by the German scholar Bruno Krusch is the only one to compare the 2 manuscripts. This is the edition still widely used today, like I employed, as did Michel Rouche. It is available online from the University of Munich. Let us now look at the Latin text. You see in line 12, Castro provinciae Limovicinae Idunum nomine, a castrum in the province of Limousin called Idunum. This is Latin from that period, not classical forms. Effractum est a Romanis ius regis Burgundianum, destroyed by the Romans on the order of the Burgundian king. These Romans troubled George Verjard, but they are in fact the Burgundians themselves of the Gallo-Roman population under their authority. They were the representatives of Constantinople in Gaul, Sigismund, with the title of a Roman patrician that Clovis envied, even called himself soldier of Emperor Anastasius, and the emperor in Constantinople. The text tells us that many prisoners were taken and that at least 3,000 were freed and resettled thanks to the intervention of Eptadii, who, imperans commanding, orders King Sigismund to release them. You can see the mention of Idunum with an H in note B, which refers to the second manuscript, and then there's note 3, Crusch writes in Latin, Idunum loci nomen corruptum videtur esse. The place name Idunum appears to be corrupted. Nevertheless, and we shall see that this is important, it is the spelling Idunum without H that has continued to prevail in line with the long editorial tradition of the first manuscript and up to the present day. Bruno Crouch indicates that Pétigny, a French author, believed it to be the oppidum of Dun in the Creuse, as did the German Binding, but in reality, Binding adds a question mark. We will come back to it later. Before continuing, I wanted you to see for yourself this second manuscript from the BNF, which is available in Gallica. This 14th century copy where we can see the name Ridunum with an H. You can see the box in red, castrum provinciae, which is abbreviated Lemovicensis, a more classical Latin form there, probably corrected. Ridunum nomine, very abbreviated here. But where is this castrum Idunum situated? This is the central, long-standing and still unresolved question. In 1739, when they published the text, the Burgundians told us that they had not been able to determine its location and that they were leaving it to the authors from Limousin to do so. What a gift! From 1775 with Joseph Nadeau to 2012 with Ian Wood, 14 authors, you see, not all from Limousin, refer to this text and give their own ideas about its location. I've used colors to make it easier to follow. At the beginning, in green, you can see that everyone thinks it is Dun-le-Palestel with a few rare exceptions. Then in 1896, the Belgian Godefroy Court in his Clovis leans toward Ain in purple, but he is troubled because the ancient name of Ain is known. It's Eptadii. So he too says that it's because the text has been altered. Michel Rouche, as we have seen, retains Dun-le-Palestel, and the Swiss Justin Favreau, in his 2002 book on the Burgundians, retains Ain because he says there are no archaeological remains in Dun. But it does not go into the case of Ain in depth. Catherine Escher, in her 2006 book on the Burgundians, says that it could be Dun-le-Palestel, Ain, or perhaps even Issoudun, but she told me that she had not actually studied the question. Ian Wood, in the collective work The Battle of Vouillers, 507, edited by Ralph Matheson, which I will come back to later, says that he had no idea. Sorry for this long list, but in reality, no one has ever really studied the issue. There are various atlases of ancient sites, published either in print or online, which summarize published data and translate it into maps. All of them attribute Idunum to Dun-le-Palestel. The Barrington Atlas of the Greek and Roman World, published in 2000 by Princeton University, notes Dun-le-Palestel with a question mark. The same is true of Pleiades, Gazette of Past Places, published online in 2012, which refers to the Barrington Atlas. The entry was written by Ralph Matheson himself, author of the English edition of the Letters of Roricius, the Bishop of Limoges, between 485 and 507, therefore a very knowledgeable expert on this period and this territory. But he doesn't know more. On the other hand, the Swedish Jon Alfell, in his Digital Atlas of the Roman Empire in 2020, while also attributing it to Dun-le-Palestel, and then without a question mark, mentions something interesting, Idunum Riodunensi. However, he doesn't give any detail. We will come back to this later. Dunum is an ancient Celtic and pre-Roman term that refers to an oppidum, an enclosed town or fortress. However, it's a suffix, and it is generally associated with a prefix that clarifies its meaning. Xavier de la Mare gives Idunum as an example, the fort of the plain. But in the case of Idunum, it's not clear what this prefix I could mean, and any more with an H. As Bruno Creuse said, it is probably corrupted and not accurate. I will now leave the texts and go to what it looks like on the ground and get to the heart of the matter, Crozant. Aerial photos show that Dun-le-Palestel is a crossroads. Crozant, on the other hand, is more of a cul-de-sac, a barred spur between rivers, which is more consistent with the geography of an oppidum. Then for Dun-le-Palestel, I carried out the same analysis of the Napoleonic cadastre as I did for Crozant, which was published in 2020 in the Memoirs of the Creuse Society. That is an archaeogeographical analysis, both morphological and toponymic. It is fairly easy to see that we are dealing with a moat and bailey castle from around the year 1000, like those built throughout Europe during that period. You can see the toponymy près de la motte, made of the mound, la tour, the tower, le fossé, the ditch, and then the shape of the mound with the fishery in green, the water, the remains of the old ditches. I've marked the boundaries of the farmyard in white, with a place named là-bas at the gate. We can clearly see that it is located at the crossroads, with a mention sur le grand chemin on the main road, indicating that it was on a major route. The family of the lords of Dun only appeared in the 11th century, with the first donation to the Abbey of Bénévent in 1080. Dun did not become parish centre until 1711. The absence of a church makes it more difficult to identify it as a castrum for the early Middle Ages, because we now know that churches were generally central to settlements during this period. In Crozant, on the contrary, the site is entirely centered around the church. The Napoleonic cadastre shows what I had designated as an ecclesiastical enclosure, or at least this oval shape around the plot known as Le Prieuré in the land registry, which is referred to as Chopelin in Crozant, perhaps the chapel, the capella, from the cloak of Saint Martin, but in any case, something linked with the church. And then we also find in the cadastre and in the land register terms that refer to an enclosed town, Mirmande, and ditches, and perhaps a beautiful and large castle, La Magine, Chapeau Joli, de l'Esprit, and the dam upstream at the level of the path perpendicular to the axis of the spur, les barrières, la chaîne, la porte. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Jacques Roger, who sadly passed away for conducting surveys around the church in 2022 that revealed a very important collection of sarcophagi, which impressed archaeologists, notably Katia Lagance, whom I would also like to thank, who told me they were piled on top of each other. This cemetery has been used at least since the 7th century, and we can see a small building at the bottom right of the image that could be an early church. We were already aware of fragments of early Christian sigillata pottery, including this one that I found in Chopelin with Jacques Soto, and I showed to specialists at the University of Clermont-Ferrand, Sandra Chabert, who dated it to between the 4th and 7th centuries. And finally, the crosses of Crozant, which I will come back to later, but in any case, something which indicates a site centered around the church in the early days of Christianity. Furthermore, and this is an important factor in the confusion between Dun-le-Palestel and Crozant, there are two charters preserved in the Limoges archives which have sometimes been attributed to Dun-sur-Oron near Bourges. The first tells us that the Viscount of Limoges, Hildegard, in the presence of his son, Guéret, acquired land in a villa called Dun, located in Bituriges territory. In Urbe Biturico, in Vicaria Dunense, in Villa Cuivocan Duno. Then about 40 years later, the same Guéret, son of Hildegard, gave the Bay of Saint-Martial in Limoges an allodial estate called Dun, probably the same site, but with much more information, with a dominial church in Dominicata, in Latin, with vineyards, meadows, woods, waters, rivers, and everything that goes with them and the men who depend on them. And then there is an interesting indication. This church is a basilica. The term basilica refers to a funeral church. You see, everything that characterizes Crozant is there. Of course, Robert de Lasteyrie, the editor of these texts, was not thinking of Crozant. He was thinking of Dun-le-Palestel. And as there was no church in Dun between 17 and 11, Camille Rivin disagrees with him and believes that it refers to Dun-sur-Oron near Bourges. Camille Rivin also entered into controversy with Maximin de Loche, who had used the text about the Vicariat du Nancy and Dun-le-Palestel, in a way the Pays Dunois, but Maximin de Loche gave up. And finally, Charles de Lasteyrie, the son of Robert, also contradicted his father by adopting the Dun-sur-Oron hypothesis in his work on the counts and viscounts of Limoges before the year 1000. The subject, therefore, seems to be closed. However, it could be interpreted differently. The description fits Crozant perfectly with its funeral church, rivers, vineyards. There are 3 references to vineyards in the village, and Crozant is located on the border between the two territories. We know that it was sometimes on one side, Bituriges, and sometimes on the other, Limousin. And we could see this as an attempt to recover Aquitaine property that had undoubtedly been entrusted by Clovis to the powers of the north, a phenomenon that was well known at the time and which gave rise to many conflicts. There are other elements and clues to the importance of this area at that time that can be found in place names. There are traces of an ancient road station at Maison, Le Pontcharot, Les Places, notably the place name Maison, which derives from the term Mancio, meaning road station. This is associated with others that I've studied elsewhere. It would take too long to discuss them there. La Quinta, which is an anthroponym, and the place name Les Garlières, which are associated with the control of the road and trade by the Roman military administration. And then on the map on the right, in a broader context, if we zoom out on the territory, we have, quite amusingly, all the terms that are in the title of Josiane Barbier's thesis, which established this relationship between ancient control sites and their takeover by the Merovingian power. Our thesis is entitled Palatium Fiscus Saltus. And here we have Saint-Benoît-du-Sault, the Saltus, the Faso forest, the Fiscus, to which we could add Forestis, which he also studies, and Dun-le-Palestel, the Palatium. If this is a Merovingian fisc territory, another clue is the tax currency itself, since at that time taxes were collected in the form of coins stamped with the name of the place where they were collected to be melted down later. This was studied by Jean-François Boyer in his thesis published in 2018. He mentions a Merovingian treant from Limousin stamped with the name Riodunum, which he was unable to attribute to known place. Maximin de Loche attempted to attribute it to a hypothetical Rieux Prédin. He said, as we have Bussière Dunois and Saint-Sulpice-le-Dunois, and Georges Vergard searched for and identified a place called Le Ris in Colondan. But if I do the same and look for place names beginning with Ris in Crozant or Freslin, I find a great many. Les Rivailles, La Riga, Ribois, Le Ruisseau du Rivaux, Le Rivaux. This because the term Ris or Rio means river in the dialect of Crozant and Freslin. So this term Riodunum could refer to the fortress of the river, just as Acitodunum is the fortress of the plain. This fortress of the river is mentioned in the text by Einhard, Charlemagne biographer, who tells us that Louis the Pious, traveling to Limoges in 830, stayed in Fines Aquitanae at Flumen Crozam in Castellum, meaning on the border of Aquitaine, in a castle located on the Creuse River. Could Riodunum be this castellum at Flumen Crozam, which later became Crozant? Another element that reminds us of this Merovingian period is the shape of the Crozant crosses. I've described it as Byzantine due to the geographical area in which they are found. But what is also important is that the objects of the same shape in the collections of major museums, such as this Elogium pool from Pergamon, kept at the British Museum, are all dated between the 5th and 7th centuries. The funerary stele of Exoperius in Marseille, in the middle, dates from the 5th century and is probably the oldest example I found. You can see the very characteristic straight crossbar, which is also found on the buckle plate from Morins, Switzerland, in the former Burgundian area ruled by the Franks after 534. And the parallelism with the shape of the Crozant crosses with this cross from the village of La Carlière. Now for something quite amusing, the King Arthur's town cross, you see on the left. You're of course familiar with the legend of King Arthur in Cornwall. Sites associated with him have been excavated since the 60s. The site at Glastonbury, where his tomb is located, and this cross, dates back to the 5th and 6th century. The site of Camelot, Cadbury Hill Fort, has yielded oriental pottery from the same period, and Tintagel Castle, which is a castle from the 13th century like Crozant, was a major center of trade with the Mediterranean from the 5th to the 7th century. It has yielded a large number of amphorae. See the map of their origin there on the right. Note the form Tintagel with this Quintana and Gregale association that I pointed out to you at the Pont Charot as being linked to the control of trade by the Roman military administration. And you can see that the lead cross on Arthur's tomb, considered by some to be 11th century forgery by the monk of Glastonbury, but possibly authentic according to others, is shaped like a Crozant cross. To conclude, see that quote from Paul Albert Février, the great historian of late antiquity. It is not a question of misleading you, it is indeed a game of hypothesis, but one based on the true body of converging evidence. This period of late antiquity is particularly difficult due to the scarcity of texts, and we still have little archaeological data. I don't have many certainties, but I have one or two. The first is that the 50 crosses in Crozant are not there by chance, and the second is that this particular shape can be accurately dated to between the 5th and 7th centuries. It is therefore a strong marker of this period around the 6th century, as is the attribution to Saint Stephen of the Church of Crozant. So, is Crozant Riodunum or Ridunum, the fortress of the river, destroyed by the Burgundians? Yes, that is my first hypothesis, and the second is that these crosses may have been made by former prisoners resettled in their homes to give thanks to God for their freedom and perhaps to protect their new villages. At the same time, a funeral basilica, a palatium, and a Merovingian fisc, that is a royal estate, would have succeeded an ancient road station. The Aquitaine nobles may then have sought to recover this territory, which had been seized by Clovis for the benefit of the north. This is perhaps what the charters tell us, with the purchase by Hildegard, then the donation by his son Géraud to the Abbey of Saint-Martial in Limoges, which allowed it to escape possible confiscation by the royal power. I also believe that it was during this period that the name changed to Crozant from the expression Castellum ad flumem Crozam, and that Géraud, the son of the Viscount of Limoges, Hildegard, began to call himself Géraud de Crozant. A little later, the lords, who established their motte at the crossroads to control traffic, took a name that had become available, Dun, which referred to the country and which had long been well known. We can guess that they were seeking for renown, since in the donation to the Abbey of Bénévent, they even give themselves a mythic ancestor who is said to have lived in the time of Saint Stephen. This change of name and the alteration of Ridunum to Idunum in manuscripts made it had never been identified with the site of Crozant, which is, in my opinion, its most obvious geographical location. Thank you.